Hello, everyone. So we're delighted to have you joining us for this inaugural lecture of the newly established Center for Constitutions in Context at Warwick Law School. For those of you who don't know me, I am David Vitale, an associate professor at Warwick Law School. And my colleague Mara Malagodi and I co-founded and now co-direct the center. So before we turn to today's lecture, what we wanted to do is just provide a bit of background on the Center for Constitutions in Context. So Mara and I co-founded the center just this year with the ultimate aim of fostering a community of researchers, both at Warwick, but also beyond, and a community of people who are interested in understanding both constitutions and constitutional law in their broader context. So, and as we've mentioned on our webpage, this includes, among other things, those constitutions' geographical, historical, political, social, and cultural contexts. And so to this end, what we sought to do is bring together in the center's membership and through the events that we ultimately organize, researchers and practitioners who work in a range of disciplines and fields. And that includes not only law, but philosophy, politics, international studies, interdisciplinary methodologies, and many more. And for the center's first year, what we've done is we've organized what we consider to be a fantastic lineup of events and speakers from across the globe, dealing with various topics, as you'll see, that range from LGBTQ+ rights to fourth branch constitutionalism to academic publishing. So we just wanted to say, please stay tuned, and we hope you can attend many of our events. And so that brings me to today's lecture. As some of you may be aware, Warwick Law School has a long-standing tradition of studying quote-unquote law in context, and that includes constitutional law in context. And this dates back to the trailblazing work of former Warwick Law School members, including Yash Ghai, Martin Laughlin, Upendra Bakshi, as well as today's esteemed speaker. So Mara and I are really thrilled to welcome her here today to deliver our inaugural lecture. So with that said, I'll turn things over to Mara to introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, David. My name is Mara Malagodi. I'm a reader here at Warwick Law School and co-director of the Center for Constitutions in Context. It is truly a great honor to host Jill Cottrell Ghai at CCC. Thank you very much, Jill, for accepting our invitation to deliver the center's inaugural lecture. David and I could not think of a more fitting speaker to launch the work of our new center. Jill was educated at the LSE and Yale Law School and taught law for over 40 years at universities around the globe, including the University of Warwick. Jill also advised on the constitution-making processes of several countries, including East Timor, the Maldives, Iraq, Somalia, and Nepal, which is where I first met her and Yash back in 2006. Since 2008, Jill has played a pivotal role in promoting knowledge and facilitating the implementation of Kenya's 2010 constitution, including as co-founder and currently chairperson of the board of directors of the Katiba Institute. Today, Jill will discuss the role of context in constitutional law scholarship and practice, drawing from her extensive global experience. Now over to David for some housekeeping.
Thanks, Mara. So just in terms of format, Jill plans to speak for approximately 50 minutes or so. And following that, we've left some time for some brief time for questions. So if you do have a question that you would like to ask Jill, please pop it into the Q&A section of Teams, and we'll do our best to kind of collect them and convey as many as time allows to Jill. So with that said, Jill, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I hope I've done all the right things, including unmuting my mic. Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, depending on what part of the world you're in. First of all, let me warmly thank Mara and David for their embarrassingly warm introduction. It is a huge and daunting honor to be invited to deliver this lecture for the Center for Constitutions in Context. As Mara said, I think I was asked particularly because of my experience in a number of countries around constitution making and because of my Warwick connection. Let me just say a word or two about the latter. My 14 years at Warwick, 1976 to 1990, were stimulating and enjoyable in many ways, a very important part of my career. They were also personally most significant. 2 years after I joined the law school, a new professor joined the law school. No causal connection between these two events, save for the links we already both had with William Twining, and in Yash Ghai's case, particularly the late and lamented Patrick McCausland, and he had known both Geoffrey Wilson and Sol Pichotto. Yash has been my husband for 22 years, and my significant other, you might say, for much longer. I should say that my experience falls very far short of his, and that in reality my own experiences were mostly with or because of him, and I know most of what I know about constitutions from him. He is, incidentally, sitting beside me. This will, because of its genesis and because of my own rather a-theoretical approach, lean towards the anecdotal. And I admit it's necessarily an example of what David Law calls tourism. He comments, the standard tourist itinerary is skewed toward Western liberal democracies and the common law world in particular. Entire regions, including most of Asia, Africa, South America, and the Middle East remain, quote, understudied and generally overlooked. At least the countries I referred to are mostly the understudied and generally overlooked. It seems natural to ask myself if I could say anything interesting about the question of context. I begin with an anecdote. In 2008, while Yash went off to Fiji, I attended a conference in Nairobi on the constitutional process for Somalia. I recall at least one plea for a genuinely Somali constitution, not one based on foreign experience. One's initial reaction to statements of this sort is perhaps to imagine that the speaker has some highly novel, truly indigenous governmental arrangement in mind. 18 months later, Yash and I were involved in the process of making a constitution for Somalia. We found ourselves in constitutionally very familiar territory, at least partly because of the Somali advisors to or staff of the Constitution Commission, who had held office or worked under the country's 1960 constitution. There were, of course, issues peculiar to Somalia. They included whether women could be judges under Islamic law. An issue generating particular heat was whether there should be only a national military, because future states like Puntland had military of their own. I recall the Commission chair's determination to ensure that a prohibition of female genital mutilation was included, as it was. My point is, though, how very familiar are the issues about government structure being debated. Yash commented on this when writing on the 1975 Papua New Guinea Constitution, on which he was an advisor. The original determination to do things, quote, through Papua New Guinea ways, and, quote, rebuild our society on the solid foundations of our ancestral land, became a situation in which, in Yash's words, we are now in the world of Western constitutionalism, the separation of powers, democracy, limited government, the independence of the judiciary. A book on the Uganda constitutional process lists 17, quote, innovations of the uniquely Ugandan 1995 constitution. Only 3 of these are really about national government institutions, in the sense of the 3 arms of government, the main issues of power. This raises the question of how far is constitutional content rooted in the true traditions, circumstances, and needs of the particular country. I just want to say a word or two about that, though it obviously is coming back later. We shouldn't forget, of course, the insights of scholars like Francis Snyder, who have shown how colonialism often radically changed traditional systems, possibly into an exploitative system. And Nicholas Haysom has commented that sometimes demands for tradition and authenticity are rather retrograde, for example, wanting to revert to a system where women have fewer rights. Some places, however, have tried to introduce even into the structure of government traditional institutions. In the Fiji 1997 constitution, the Great Council of Chiefs, the GCC, actually though, a creation of the British colonial government, actually appointed or made recommendations on a significant number of senators and the ceremonial president and vice president. The 2012 commission tried for a compromise. The GCC was, quote, recognized as a custodian of indigenous Fijian culture and traditions, and as a non-partisan organ of civil society existing to promote traditional culture and advise government on it. No doubt the Prime Minister was furious about this because he had previously sidelined the GCC and actually abolished it earlier in 2012. The South African Constitution allows for the possibility of traditional courts and for a national or local councils of traditional leaders, and these have been established by law, though they have advisory functions only, not, one might say, core functions like lawmaking. I've been visualizing a constitution-making process and its outcome in its context, ignoring divine and celestial impacts, of which I'm not sure we have much evidence. I begin with the broadest type of context, the international, moving in a sense inwards towards the local context, even sometimes micro context, the last being particularly based on my personal observation. The nature of those contexts vary enormously, as David was just saying, even within the geographical, historical, political, social, and cultural, including the factual, or the perceptions of the factual, the habitual, the religious, the philosophical, the psychological. John Elster has identified desires, beliefs, motivations, within which he wrote of personal, group, and institutional interests, passion, sudden or long-standing, and reason, the genuine concern with the public interest. As part of the political, no doubt, just a small point, there is the financial context. One author says that the Uganda Commission was financed by the government, which gave the executive, quote, additional leverage over it. Starting at the broadest level with the international. The end of the Cold War certainly played an important part in Kenya's history. In the 1990s, once President Moi had lost the support of Western powers that sustained him, the anti-Moi movement became also a quest for a new constitution. It began really with 1991, when the constitution was amended to remove the one-party system. International may include the United Nations. For example, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. In Nepal, I found their tick box approach a bit inadequate. They produced a list of rights, drafting very much on the lines of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But actually, the wording of a treaty is not always suitable for adoption in a national constitution. I also found their focus on human rights did not really extend at that point to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Our work in Nepal, 2006 to 8, had been under UNDP. And someone from UNDP, I cannot remember who, came to Yash in the early stages of the Kenyan process, in 2001, I think, saying, we can do it for you. Pretty remarkable in view of the person to whom the offer was made. Most people, and that includes politicians, know little about international law, but specific groups may know a good deal about relevant treaties. In Fiji, the ethnic Fijian community relied heavily on what they maintained was their indigenous status, looking to ILO Treaty 169, the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention 1989. They also looked to Malaysia as a country that had constitutionally enshrined affirmative action for its own indigenous community, the Malay. A retired Malaysian judge was even appointed to advise the Fiji government during the process that led to the 1997 constitution, though apparently he was rather disappointed. In Nepal, the same treaty was much cited by the Adivasis, indigenous groups. They had made connection with other indigenous groups, including in Latin America, which is very interesting. This was the time when Evo Morales, the first indigenous person president of Bolivia, was elected, and its new constitution was being developed, one that uses the word indigenous 124 times, and includes things like the rights of farmers, of indigenous people and nations' origin. Women and groups of persons with disability also often find support for their constitutional positions in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or that on the rights of persons with disability. Both were prominent in Kenya. and particularly, I think, the women. There was a phrase that was bandied about a people-led process. And Yash sometimes said, really, it was a woman-led process. The women were the most active during the National Constitutional Conference. The 1995 Beijing Women's Conference adoption of the concept of a critical mass of women in legislative and other roles is reflected in the Kenya Constitution, with its rather strangely worded provision now, no more than 2/3 of either gender. Men didn't want to be left out, in elected and appointed public office. International, of course, may be narrower, such as the interest of foreign countries in resources of the constitution-making country. Quotation, Western powers, I read, wanted Afghanistan to be governed by a strong executive who had unilateral discretion to sign agreements with foreign countries. Then there's the non-state foreign influence, funded very often by or through UNDP, National NDI, IRI, in the International IDEA, the Forum of Federations, all of which we have worked with at various points, Conciliation Resources and the American Bar Foundation, Bar Association, were very and usefully involved in the Fiji 2012 process. Foreign groups may include those advocating for justice for particular sections of society, including LGBTIQ and women. And there are sometimes, of course, anti-gay or anti-abortion, often religious groups. At a conference in Nairobi in 2008 at a university, an American spoke at length only about and against abortion. Kenya was trying to guarantee the non-recurrence of regimes that locked up and tortured dissenters. This anti-abortion obsession, I'm afraid, struck a really jarring note in my mind. I've also wondered whether LGBTQ advocacy, with which I have entire sympathy, might be counterproductive. The South African Constitution's prohibition of discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation has inspired others. The Fiji 1997 Constitution included the same idea in the bill finally presented to Parliament, which passed unanimously. The source was assumed to be a foreign drafter. A few years later, moves began to be made to amend the Constitution for the first time to remove sexual orientation. However, an unrelated coup intervened. In 2012 in Fiji, it seemed that a major campaign had persuaded people all over the country to tell the Constitution Commission, which was chaired by Yash, we don't want gay marriages. In East Timor, I was unaware of any focus on sexual orientation in the Human Rights Committee of the Constituent Assembly. But sexual orientation did appear in the draft bill, produced by a committee chaired by a young man, I think, educated in Australia. In the full assembly, contributions almost alternated between those who said something like, our young people are already too oriented towards sex, and those who understood the phrase sexual orientation and didn't want it. One brave young woman spoke in favor. In Kenya, the gay marriage objection became enshrined in the Constitution under everyone has the right to marry a person of the opposite sex. I can't help wondering whether maybe more subtle advice, perhaps relying on sex as including sexual orientation, might have allowed a less in-your-face effort to change, and in the end have had at least as good a result. It's really a matter of, if you like, techniques of trying to achieve change in somebody else's system. Now I move to constitutions as context, because I think point out that the work of France and the newly created USA, the subjects of perhaps John Elster's most often referred to work, were making constitutions without having had a previous document. These days, almost any state now setting out to make a constitution already has or has had one, unless they're breakaway states, of course, like elements of the former Yugoslavia or East Timor. The dominant group in the government of East Timor rejected everything Indonesian, even language. Yash Ghai's own notes on his visit to East Timor included the statement, for the most part, it is unencumbered by past state structures. In almost a literal sense, it starts with a clean slate. But what did they do? They looked to Portugal, their original colonial power. The Portuguese and Mozambican constitutions were much in evidence in the Constituent Assembly. Its proceedings were conducted largely in Portuguese, and young Portuguese lawyers serviced the committees. I found myself asked to explain to the Human Rights Committee what fascism was, because Article 46.4 of the Portuguese Constitution prohibited military associations and organizations that are racist or display a fascist ideology. Radical departure can occur. A study of the making of the Hungarian constitution says from the old constitution, almost only one sentence remains, that the capital of the country is Budapest. Many countries have a tendency to hark back to their earlier constitutions. I think perhaps not just because that's something they're used to doing, but because maybe a nostalgia for a period when things were perceived to be more peaceful. But people used to doing things in a certain way may insist on inserting things that were in the old constitution, even if they don't fit in the new one very well. In the Kenyan Bill of Rights, a new approach to how rights may be restricted, derived from the South African Constitution and found elsewhere, was not fully understood, and certain sentences from the old Constitution were clumsily inserted. It's not only a country's own constitutional history that is part of the context. Take, again, a local example. The Kenyan Constitution drew in various respects on that of South Africa, and Yash and I have written about that. Kenya's close neighbor, Uganda, developed its current constitution a few years before Kenya. The chair of its commission, Benjamin Odoki, was invited by Yash to share his experiences with the CKRC, and a number of features in the Ugandan constitution do find an echo in Kenya's. For example, the stress on people's sovereignty and various commissions. Though arguably this is not necessarily a matter of direct cause and effect, because certain ideas, I think, can be in the constitutional air, as it were. One that did not get into the Kenya document was a list of tribes, as in the Uganda constitution. The Kenya Committee on Culture wanted to include not only tribes, but their traditional dress and their traditional brews. The chair invited communities to put their names forward, but as the number of claimant tribes, usually assumed to be 42, headed for 100, even the Culture Committee agreed this was not a great idea. Again, as examples of taking from other constitutions, India had a truly Indian process, although they were heavily influenced by the UK practice enshrined in their 1935 Government of India Act. They also studied the Irish constitution, from which they took directive principles of state policy, the expression weaker sections of society, and a ban on titles of nobility is issued by the state. As later countries gained independence or revised their constitutions, there's been much more South-South contact and input. And now, of course, the internet has made almost every constitution available to almost everyone interested in contact, everything we do, really. When Yash was first invited to return to Solomon Islands in 2014 to assist in reconsideration of their constitution, we found online a draft constitution for Solomon Islands clearly based on that of Kenya. I can't remember who did it. Foreign advisors are not needed for this process. Probably most people involved in constitution-making processes, except in small, more expert commissions, do not read many or even any of other countries' constitutions, but they can still have an idea of particularly what their neighbours have been doing. Then looking this slightly more broadly, the discipline of constitutions and comparative constitutions. There's a considerable literature on constitution making, which of course tends to stress the same issues. The work of writers like Arendt Lippard and Don Horowitz, to take but two, influence processes, if only through foreign advisors. In my own report on East Timor, I commented there's a very large literature and a good deal developed precisely for constitution drafters. Yet every time a constitution comes to be drafted, it seems that a whole collection of wheels are reinvented. Papers are written for the drafters and the public on what is a constitution, what is a Bill of Rights, etc. Things I think have improved perhaps since then. A lot of literature designed more generally, not just for specific countries. On reflection, I wondered if there's any reality to the idea that constitutions should be autochthonous in content terms. Generic literature of this kind may contribute to a sort of homogenization of the collectivity of constitutions. I'm not sure anyone has written a book on how to write a really different constitution. On the other hand, the people of countries that set out to make a constitution, certainly the sorts of people who take the initiative, do not begin with a blank slate, but are aware of both of their own constitutional histories and of other countries. Would it really make sense for them to ignore or be deprived of literature on the subject? I just wanted to comment on the fact that if one visualizes the flow of ideas internationally, one would have to show that not all flows are with equal strength between all origins and destinations. This is, of course, the result of history, particularly coupled with language. My impression is of relatively little contact between the French and the common law constitutional traditions, and one meets far fewer Latin American scholars than North American, European, or even Asian. Most then have a few words to say about advisors. Most advisors are probably not appointed because of knowledge of their own systems, nor necessarily enthusiasts for their own system. Though Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg got a good deal of stick for suggesting in a speech in Cairo in 2012 that Egyptians should look for guidance to constitutions more recent than that of her own country. Advisors may be involved in a particular country throughout the constitution-making process. In Iraq, Nicholas Haysom headed the UN advisory body for over a year with a few others, during which time other people like Yash and myself came and went, often for short visits. Some come with knowledge of the particular countries or countries with similar traditions, while others come from rather different contexts. Many Western advisors, including myself, necessarily fit the latter description, though many build up considerable knowledge of closely relevant jurisdictions. I have met advisors from South Africa and other African countries, Sri Lanka, Iraq, Eritrea, Australia, as well as Canada and the US. And Professor Hashim Kamali, distinguished Afghan scholar of Islamic law, visited his own country to join the Afghan Commission that was from Malaysia, where he was teaching, and then was also advisor on the processes of Maldives, Iraq, and Somalia, focusing on the place of Islam. There may be other particular areas of expertise: federalism, devolution, elections, human rights. Some come as drafters. Philip Knight from Canada played an important role in getting the South African Constitution both readable and precise, and was also important in both phases of the Kenya process, in Fiji and in Somalia. What they do may vary enormously. Some may be formally part of an official process, though relatively rarely. Fiji's 1990s process was chaired by a New Zealander, and its 2012 abortive process included 2 foreigners, one of them Yash, the other one Christina Murray, and 3 Fiji citizens. Some may be involved in detailed discussions with people actively involved in difficult negotiations, while others stay more in the background, commenting in response to requests. Some may be advisors to non-government groups, perhaps parties. The presence of some may be acknowledged, or some may be almost kept secret. Some are invited, and others just turn up. Returning to the Ugandan constitution, the uniquely Ugandan constitution. National goals and directive principles may be new for Uganda, but via India have found their way to a wide range of countries. Nigeria in 1979, rejected in favor of socioeconomic rights in South Africa in 1993. How did they come to Uganda? A light bulb moment. The only foreign advisor in Uganda, as I understand, was an Australian with a wealth of experience of Papua New Guinea, which in 1975 adopted national goals and directive principles. Similarly, among the innovations in Uganda was a leadership code, which is a Papua New Guinea phrase and part of their constitution, and indeed perhaps a Papua New Guinea idea. These brief reflections prompt me to ask a couple of questions. First, on knowledge. One may be invited or not at very short notice to a country of which one knows little more than the average newspaper reader. How much do people learn? How do they learn it? How much does it matter? May it actually be better to say, this idea worked like this in this country, like that in another country for these reasons, and it's for you to decide whether it's worth your considering it as you understand your context far better than I ever can. Then there's language. As I've indicated, I've been to various non-English speaking countries. If drafting is done in the local language or in English first, a big translation effort is required, and fast. In Nepal, our unit produced a bilingual version, Nepali and English, of the interim constitution. It was fascinating and sobering to be present at the sessions with several Nepali translators, none of them lawyers, I think, arguing vehemently about the correct translations of single phrases and sentences, showing what a very difficult issue translation really is. So it just makes me wonder, how clearly do advisors always understand the thinking of those they are advising? And how far can people, especially from the public perhaps, be given an understanding of what has been learned, hopefully, from foreign advisors? There's clearly considerable scope for research on these issues, and there is some existing literature. Cheryl Saunders raised some important questions, including, quote, there is no guarantee, in fact, that the knowledge is applicable. No quality control over its content or the manner in which it was provided, and no lines of accountability to the recipient state. Turning now to more local contexts. Geography I looked at, sort of raised my eyebrows slightly, but of course, yes. Apart from the proximity to other countries, internal geography, take Nepal. Being from the mountain, the hill, or the plain, the terai, is a theme of Nepali life and, of course, governance. Public participation is a great challenge. Contact with some communities can mean weeks of walking. And as discussion of setting up a federal system developed, people would present proposals for dividing the country, in which an important feature would be whether the individual units should cross all 3 geographic zones or be within one only. So at conferences we organized, they were producing maps that showed constituent states running north-south or east and west according to their proposals. Fiji is a nation of islands, affecting communication, the impact of voting methods, and issues of access to rights, for example. The 2012 Constitution Commission proposed proportional representation with multi-member electoral districts, none of them having, quote, fewer than 5 seats to ensure a reasonable minimum number of representatives from districts comprising widely scattered islands. Because the populations were tiny and were in serious danger of never having any representation at all. And the Bill of Rights in that Fiji 2012 draft included, quote, reasonable access to transportation or other means of conveying the produce of their labor to marketplaces, prompted by communication difficulties between islands and for remote villages on larger islands. And just another little tidbit. In 2004, we were briefly advisors to the Sri Lankan Muslim Congress. The main base of that Congress was in the east of Sri Lanka, and the geographical distribution of people was uneven. They were proposing a model for non-contiguous federalism. They sometimes called it the Pondicherry model, by analogy with the Indian territory that comprises 4 separate areas. We were not very encouraging, particularly because, unlike the elements of Pondicherry, those of the imagined Eastern Muslim territory would be separated by, as it were, hostile territory. This idea, I think, has cropped up repeatedly, but Sri Lanka is one of the countries that has not so far managed to really significantly revise its constitution over a relatively long period. Just wanted to raise an issue of land as context. Of course, it's physically context, but whereas a constitution in the global north is unlikely to say much about land, beyond perhaps a right to property, land has enormous importance in the politics and economy, culture, and even sense of self in many developing countries. In Fiji, the big ethnic divide was between the indigenous Fijian and the Indo-Fijian communities, contributed to by the fact that many of the Fijian land-only communities had leased land to Indians, mainly for cane farming. The 1997 constitution included a novel compact, which read in part, the people of the Fiji Islands recognize that within the framework of this constitution and the other laws of the state, the conduct of government is based on the following principles. B, the ownership of Fijian land according to Fijian custom. At least 5 statutes about land could be amended only with difficulty under the heading of group rights. But the government of 2012 had set its mind against the older land laws. The Constitution Commission draft included many clauses protective of traditional rights and had heard evidence from members of the Indo-Fijian community that they had no basic problems with those laws. That the original draft of the government's 2013 constitution did not protect indigenous rights. They were compelled to change that. No part of the law in Kenya has raised stronger emotions over the years than the law relating to land and its administration, and none is of more importance at present. This statement is from Ghai and McCausland's 1970 book on Kenya's constitution. It opens Ambrina Manji's 2020 book on land and politics in Kenya, just to show the continued and fundamental importance of land in a country like Kenya. And a chapter in the 2010 Constitution tries to set up a whole new system of administering land and making land policy. But still, land was a key issue that threatened the acceptance of the Constitution in 2010. I don't want to say much about divided societies, or there's huge literature on this. I just wanted to say how important, how often it is. Countries do have divisions within society. Very few societies are without, even Somalia, which likes and is always assumed to be ethnically homogeneous. It's not just a matter of clans, of which there are said to be 4.5, the 4 biggest and the rest. Apparently, there are 2 versions of the Somali language, and the Provisional Constitution mentions both of them as versions of the official language. And the Provisional Constitution bars discrimination on the basis of clan, but doesn't otherwise mention it. But there is apparently a clear understanding that representation will be based on that 4.5 principle. Now I want to bring together 3 sort of issues: political culture, civil society, role of organized civil society, and public participation under the heading of the people. Armand of Verber many years ago labeled the way populations may be involved or not as politically parochial subject or participant, that is, having a vague awareness of politics, or seeing themselves as subjects of politics only, or believing themselves to have a role in politics. All too often, citizens in developing countries fit into the second. They have a role, but in performing it are basically directed by their leaders. Civil society mirrors, but also affects the culture. As I said, people-led process was a catchphrase. Willie Mutunga, a former Chief Justice, wrote a book on the push towards a constitution in the 1990s called Constitution Making from the Middle, expounding in great detail the role of the middle class who organize themselves in various ways to bring about change. There are still commentators who would argue that eventually the politicians triumphed, while others say that the people forced the politicians to accept a constitution. On public participation generally, those involved in every recent process have probably been told that process is as important as content, and have often gone on pilgrimage to South Africa to learn more about public participation. Iraq and Somalia are clear examples of where participation was extremely difficult, although some organizations were trying to carry out some public consultation. The 2012 process in Fiji was in marked contrast to that for the 1997 constitution. In January 2012, the Citizens' Constitutional Forum was still experiencing government resistance to its even talking about the constitution. The official process began at the beginning of July that year, lasted for 6 months. One destination of public consultation, the organization was there at the same time as the Constitution Commission. People had had effectively no opportunity really to learn, think, and contribute, except on gay marriage. What's the purpose of participation, you might ask? Is it to affect the content? I have a sense that in the Kenyan process, public participation tended to reinforce approaches already envisaged by the Constitution Commission. This is particularly true of economic, social, and cultural rights. It was common, very common, for the main themes of public meetings to be things like roads, housing, education, water. Similar experience in Nepal. I remember trying to convince a generally well-informed and committed Nepali MP and member of the Constituent Assembly, who said that roads, etc., had nothing to do with constitutions. I'm not sure whether we convinced him, but the Nepal Constitution does include rights to housing, health, food, and education. How about attitudes? Is it affected by public participation? One study on Uganda concluded that people who had participated in the constitution-making process did not have a more positive attitude to the constitution than anyone else. The main influence, what really affected them, was the view of their political leaders, which I fear is very generally true. It makes me think about referendums. It's politically useful, for example, to be able to say that Kenya's constitution was adopted by almost 70% of Kenyans. But if it had not been endorsed by President Kibaki and his Prime Minister, Raila Odinga, who had been pushed together in a sense by the post-election violence of 2007 to 8, it's improbable that 70% would have voted for it. And I looked at the figures and realized that where from their home areas or their supporting areas, the votes were in the region of even over 90 in the home areas of both of them. But in the Rift Valley, support was down to 20 or 30%, or even 5 or 7% in some constituencies. That's our current constitution we're talking about. There was a strong anti-constitution based in the Rift Valley, concerned particularly with land. But I'm pretty certain that the lead was taken in these areas from the leaders, including our current president. Kenya's youthful anti-government demonstrators, I must say, they're anti-government, but they're pro-constitution. It may be difficult to determine empirically why, but I would hypothesize that one factor may have been the public participation around its making, which has left Kenyans with a sense, I believe, that the constitution is important to them. One could also say a little bit about politicians' political culture. All too obvious are the motivations for being in politics. To do some good for the nation, to do some good for their community, or for themselves. If parties have an ideology that goes beyond loyalty to a particular group, politicians are more likely to think of politics achieving something. Kenya is an example of a country where political parties are essentially support groups for particular politicians. They're not about policy or ideology. What does it tell you about, the motives of the politicians who join them? Ghai asked a leader of a major political party in the National Constitutional Conference in Kenya why his members were not following the party line. His response? He was unable to prevent them following ethnic interests. Now, even politicians' selfish behavior may be legal, but it may well become corrupt. In countries where corruption is almost intrinsic to public life, it would be foolish to assume it cannot affect constitution making. There were hints of personal benefit, land maybe for Ghai, during the Kenyan process, if he would agree to slow down the process. And apparently in 2005, Museveni openly bribed 70% of the MPs in Uganda to pass the amendments to the 1995 constitution that, among other things, allowed him to stay in office. It does make you wonder how much of our constitution, certainly we know laws are often passed as a matter of bribery. I wanted to say just 2 quick points about religion, which is an obvious context in countries where religious beliefs are very important. I sense that the West was almost offensively concerned about how Muslim countries express the role of Islam in their law. It revealed a suspicion of Islam, and I wondered how much difference it actually made whether countries required law to comply with the general principles of Sharia, or the established provisions of Islam, or any tenet of Islam, or the sacred religion of Islam, or to put Sharia as the main source of legislation. Which are the various expressions that were used in countries we worked in. In Fiji in 1997, there was some demand, and still in 2012 a little bit, for a Christian state. One of the things that I find depressing is that how the condemnatory and divisive aspects of religious beliefs tend to be prominent. Bans on gay marriage, on abortion, attempts to restrict activities on Sundays, attempts to insist on the priority of the main religion, regardless of other religious groups in the country, or even the irreligious, are more evident than love thy neighbor. At least freedom of religion is standard, even in the Constitution of Iran. I also wanted to say a little bit about who actually makes the decision, which you wouldn't read from reading the law and the description of a constitution-making process. Of course, certain people are very particularly prominent, but it's interesting to realize how prominent Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel were actually in the Indian constitution process. But I wanted to say something about how the things that, as I say, on the surface, you might think a Constitution Commission made the decisions, is often not the case. And in Kenya, I just want to there was the formal arrangement under which at both phases of making a Kenya constitution, it had to end up in Parliament. But what I wanted particularly to emphasize is that sometimes things get taken over. In fact, in Kenya, it happened twice. The first phase, draft constitution, was taken over by government in 2005, assisted by a court decision. And they changed it drastically, and it was rejected by a referendum. In 2010, the constitution was taken over by a political committee, part of the written down process. But what they did was, among other things, to change our system to a presidential system, radically from essentially parliamentary system. And this has happened in a number of other countries. In the last few days of our trip to Iraq in 2015, we were told that the official process had stopped and decisions were being sent to political leaders. Quote from a writer, constitutional negotiations took place in a series of private ad hoc meetings between Kurdish and Shia party leaders, termed by committee members bitin, excluding, you will notice, the Sunni members. I want to pass over now to what I have also written is on the question of courts as context. Just to say something about timing. I'm not talking about a constitutional moment. I'm just talking about the fact that sometimes decisions are made quickly, sometimes they drag out. I wondered if the decision to shift to a presidential system in Kenya might have been more resisted if it had been earlier. Then the earlier stages, the recollections of the imperial presidency of Daniel Arap Moi were fresher, and there had been much discussion of an executive president or an executive prime minister, and people were engaged in discussion about the subject. As it was, they were sort of taken by surprise, almost ambushed in the final stages. In Nepal, in 2006, I attended a meeting organized by the Blue Diamond Society for Gays, listened to a speech by a young man talking about the difficulties that gay people faced in Nepal. I have a sense that the assertion of rights that accompanied the Maoist revolution and the wish to see everyone included led to a more easy accommodation of gays and trans people, along with the Dalits and the Adivasis, the indigenous groups in Nepal. The young man who spoke at that meeting was, I believe, Suril Pant, who was later elected to the Constituent Assembly. Many things affect timing. In Nepal, one factor, I'm afraid, was that once the Constituent Assembly, which doubled as Parliament, was elected, then a lot of political effort went into jockeying for power, using all the tricks of a parliamentary system. And this took priority, and they didn't adopt a constitution until 2015. We'd left the country in 2008. In Kenya, there was much foot dragging, some for those who didn't want a constitution at all, and some from people who wanted to make the gravy train of the process last as long as possible. This, I'm afraid, is a feature of Kenya's political culture. In East Timor, Iraq, and Somalia, significant pressure from the US government, or in the last, a senior UN bureaucrat, led to the end of processes being hurried, or indeed not really ended. Just a final point. Something that often overlooked in this, I think, last-minute rushed changes may mean poor drafting. Constitutional scholarship often looks at the big issues, but serious consequences in terms of expense, loss of respect for the Constitution, and even loss of workability may result from hurried drafting. That rather mundane thought may be a suitable point to end in view of time, rather than on a final thought, which was about how many countries actually failed to get a constitution. This even more depressing thought. At this point, I think I will stop. I'm sure I've overrun my time a bit. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Jill. So I just wanted to reiterate to everyone in the audience, if you would have any questions that you would like us to put forward to Jill, I will continue to collect. We have a few, so I'll start with those, but please feel free to pop them into the Q&A and we'll convey them. So I'll start with one question. So we have a question asking you to speak a bit more about the persistence of constitutional myths. So the question says, so you spoke about the Kenyan Constitution eschewed how the Kenyan Constitution eschewed the Ugandan approach of listing tribes, despite a suggestion that it should. Your explanation of why the approach was not followed was due to the sheer volume of possible tribes. However, in 2017, the Kenyan Gazette identified a 44th tribe, Asians, as if it were the case that there was constitutional recognition of some number of tribes. So the question continues, is this an example of constitutional ideas being quote unquote in the air despite not being in the text? If one wanted to kill a constitutional idea, how to go about it? Clearly, the executive shouldn't pretend something exists in the Constitution if it does not, but they were speaking to a longing amongst that quote-unquote tribe that clearly did exist and could gain the government a political advantage.
Okay. This is a particularly curious example, the 44th tribe. But it does indicate, something about myths. Yes, Kenyans do talk about the importance of tribe. And I had mentioned there are 42, right? The 43rd, no, I can't exactly remember which was the 43rd. Another community, originally non-Kenyan, which has been part of Kenya for a very long time, was recognized by the government as a tribe. And this has happened to the Nubians and to at least one other community from elsewhere in Africa. The 44th tribe is Yasha's tribe. It was Indians, Asians. It's very peculiar. And it was the result of the former president being approached, Uhuru Kenyatta, approached by a number of Asian business people, asking for recognition as a community. And it is a curious thing, isn't it, to think that you get recognized by being called a tribe, even though your community consists of Punjabis, Gujaratis, particularly in Kenya, and a whole number of other people, and many of whom, and between whom, of course, there's sometimes been considerable strife. Zarina Patel and I wrote an article criticizing this and saying it was clearly just some political motive. But yes, clearly the government felt it was getting some political benefit from this, and the particular community felt that it was getting some sort of recognition that it didn't otherwise have. This was followed up to this year by some suggestion that Diwali, the principal Hindu holiday, should be formally recognized in Kenya. I don't think there are many Indians who would wish to do that. And of course, the business community would not generally be very enthusiastic about adding to public holidays because it adds to their expense if they want their workers to work those days. It is a myth. I mean, really, what has happened since more recently is that the census, the 10-year census, now doesn't try to fit people into formal categories. It actually simply asks people how they identify themselves. If they don't, the enumerators are supposed to sort of say this person seems to be a whatever. But there is nothing in the Kenya Constitution that gives any particular status in a sense, except, let me put it like this, except that it's recognized that in some places, like the lower level of government, they are supposed to not to have more than 70% of their staff of one community, of the dominant community. In a sense, there's a recognition of the ethnic diversity is certainly recognized in the Constitution and protected in the Constitution, but the actual status of an individual tribe is not. Incidentally, I don't know exactly what happens in Uganda. The list in the Uganda Constitution dates from 1926, which is the year in which the border between Uganda and Kenya was finalized. And in a sense, the boundaries of Kenya, and I assume those of Uganda, were sort of finally established. But I have no idea what the current situation is and whether it actually means anything in the Ugandan situation. But yes, some things are used for political reasons, and sometimes ridiculed too. In that case, what happened? There was the meeting of the National Constitutional Convention. People were coming forward, and it just looked as though it was going to go on and on and on. And then, people endless small groups would be saying, actually, we're different from them, and we have different, we have different this, we have different brews, we have different traditions or something. It seemed to be a divisive thing, not something that was truly going to bring the country together. That's why people agreed, let's stop this.
Okay, great, thanks. So we have one other question. So the attendee asks basically two questions. So one is about theory, and the other is more kind of practice oriented. So I'll start with the theoretical one. They say, the theoretical question is, how do you define context itself? So is it like, quote unquote, when you see it or when we are there, we know it? And if so, is it possible to do constitutional comparison in a meaningful way, that is comparative constitutional law in context?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it was one of the questions that Mara had sort of suggested also. Yes, I mean, I think, let me just go. In a sense, you could say everything is contextual, but then perhaps I've interpreted the word too widely. But on the whole, I think it's, I don't think that the whole idea defeats, the idea, the notion of context does not defeat the idea of comparative constitutional advice or even comparative constitutional studies. It's, in fact, I think it probably makes it much more interesting. In other words, context, immediately you step outside, the words of the document. You're surely going to encounter context. Because I have been thinking about how much, when a constitution is drafted, we actually want to change the behavior of people. The behavior of politicians. We want to stop them being so corrupt. We want them to focus in their decision-making on rights and the people rather than on themselves. We want to change the people. We want the people to be interested. We want them to participate. We encourage them, in a sense, in a constitution, actually to demand from the state compliance with the constitution, especially through a Human Rights Commission and through the courts. So a constitution almost by itself is not much more than a piece of paper. Context is absolutely essential. Political parties, for example. I've often been struck and occasionally written about how the Kenya Constitution tries to promote a sort of Western idea of a political party based on ideology, where there is a loyalty to the political party, where you can lose your seat in parliament if you quit a political party across the floor. And as I say, and yet we have to recognize that every constitution will work in a way that when we read the document is probably not predicted. It's going to depend very much on the political culture of the politicians and of the people. Yes, they can change, I think, but you cannot sort of overnight change the way people think about constitutions and the way they react to them. Actually, arguably, this is true of any law, of course, but more so perhaps to constitutions. Does it preclude comparative studies? I think not. I would have thought that, in fact, it made the studies more interesting. And it's not that similar issues do not arise in different countries. And the reactions, what's probably important is the way in which the state within the constitution reacts to its experience of coming up against the realities of its society, history, geography, or whatever it is. It is affecting the way, in fact, the constitution has been working and may work and so on. So it seems to me it enriches, it in fact makes the field of comparative constitutional studies very challenging, but absolutely fascinating.
And then the second practical question, they say, concerns the role of public participation in constitution making that you mentioned. Yes. So the question is it meant to confirm the draft constitutional text, or is it to allow the people to decide on it de novo?
Yes, well, I just sort of touch on that because I've been thinking about that a lot. And as I said, I think in the Kenya context, I know that many of the ideas that were being discussed were things that Yash personally and other people in the field had been talking about for a long time. You know, beginning to have economic, social, and cultural rights in the constitution is one such thing. And those things that the chair of the Uganda Commission emphasized, like stressing people's sovereignty. It's not just a question of we the people adopt the constitution and so on. But yes, I wonder when people set up a system and they say we have to have people-led process and so on. I suspect that the people who pass the law, draft the law and pass it, have fairly strong ideas themselves about what they want to go into the constitution, and they probably hope that people will go along with them and have rather similar ideas. So I'm not sure that necessarily they are anticipating that radical changes will come about by talking to the people. On the other hand, I think you can get some ideas about what really matters to people. But as I say, often that is issues like we used to say after the end of a meeting, 600 people perhaps in a meeting, very few would talk about the system of government, but they would talk about education, health, water, food. and so on. But on the other hand, as we said to this MP in Nepal, how you achieve those things, is a very much a constitutional matter. And if you're not thinking in your constitution, in your drafting a constitution, of what that constitution is for, which is the best interest of the people, then maybe you're not doing the right sort of job. Yes, I've read, somewhere somebody who said it's to give legitimacy. This is about a referendum. This is an awfully depressing idea, isn't it? That you go to the enormous expense of having a referendum in a country, and not because you want the people, you're particularly interested in what the people think any longer. You just want them to say yes. And you want them to say yes in sufficiently large numbers that you can say, the people have adopted it. I don't know. It almost seems to me this is a bit of a fraud. It would be much more important to have a really good process and serious discussion and open so people know what's happening than actually then herding them into the voting booths at the end of the day. It was interesting, of course, because the argument that led to the ending of the first phase of the Kenya constitution making process was that you must have a referendum. This is what the High Court decided. The government seized on it, took it up, took the opportunity to make some radical changes in the draft, but then was stuck with the necessity to have a referendum, which said no. Although, to be perfectly honest, I was never sure that anybody, the government, including President Kibaki, was desperately upset that the answer was no, because so many people, politicians actually in office, are not that keen on having a new constitution when the current constitution is the one that's got them into office and given them their powers. Anyway, that's a very cynical attitude. So yeah, it is actually quite difficult. And I agree that that, as I say, I still have a sort of lingering sense that it is very striking in Kenya. The politicians will talk about the constitution and say such and such bit of the constitution is not working. We went to a celebration of the 15th anniversary of the Constitution on the 27th of August, a seriously alternative, if you like, people's sort of occasion. Nobody, absolutely nobody said the Constitution needed to be changed. They all said the problem is the politicians are not following the Constitution. So it's two different perspectives on the. And would the people, there is a certain positivity in Kenya about the Constitution, which I can't believe has nothing to do with the way in which the Constitution was drafted all those years ago.
We've had a few questions come in, so I'll do my best to get through them. So the next question we have is there a constitution that you consider to be the best example of one that is mostly, quote unquote, owned by or reflective of local priorities instead of foreign or Western ones?
Yeah, it's interesting because as I was writing and I was saying, so much of the core stuff is sort of, there are, of course, variations of, yes, you can, especially with things like devolution, you can reflect, it is a reflection of the state of the nation, almost certainly, and then electoral systems are often taken into account, the nature of the political scene, as it were. But we often used to say that the politicians cared about power. The people cared about, of course, they cared about electoral systems, but the people cared really about things like rights and about including economic, social, and cultural rights. So there was a sort of difference between very often what the politicians were about, which is about power, and what the people were about, which is about their lives and their livelihoods. So I'm not sure I would be prepared to put forward any candidate really for the prize winner of the most people responsive constitution. But clearly, I'm sort of running out of steam perhaps on that. Really, I say, I'm be honest, I'm not sure I've got a candidate.
No, fair enough. Next question we have is perhaps a tough one. How do you know when a country is in a quote unquote constitutional moment?
It's a very difficult question. It was interesting how political commentators used that idea when they were writing about the constitutional process. Ones who wanted to rubbish it really and say, oh, Kenya hasn't got a constitutional moment, we're not going to get a constitution. But what I did want to say is that this is actually quite a serious problem. As I said, so many of the countries we've worked in ended up without a constitution, or without a constitution that met all the issues were not resolved. Iraq is a striking example. They did adopt something called a constitution, but it really could certainly not be considered to be adopted by the people. The Sunnis were essentially excluded. It apparently took into the final draft something from an earlier document, which is even less democratically prepared. And a lot of the issues were admittedly left unclarified. And there, we went to, between us, I think, 4 conferences in different parts of the world, pleasant places to have conferences, trying to discuss the missing issues, which I think have never been. And it is actually worrying when you come to countries like Afghanistan, for example. I read an interesting article. We were in Afghanistan at a time where things seemed sort of optimistic. But this article I read said with the Afghan constitution, in a sense, drafting the constitution brought to the fore all the tensions within Afghan society. So instead of, as some people have often argued, what you want is a process of making a constitution that at the same time sort of brings people together in this supposedly positive activity, and then you resolve the tensions and the difficulties in society. In Afghanistan, it seems to have done the opposite. In Libya, did adopt a constitution, quite remarkably, considering the divisions which were developing in the country, but never was able to have a referendum which was required for its adoption. So, yes, I was really agonizing over this. How do we know when a country is ready for making a constitution? I think one can dramatize that too much. I think it was very obvious in Kenya by the early part of this century that a constitution was very much on the agenda, although it was still tied up very much with getting rid of President Moi. And there were some people who were prepared to give the priority to getting rid of President Moi, over the question of and some of them who did actually said, once we've got rid of Moi, then in fact there was a song, without Moi, everything is possible. Even that there are some people, even in Kenya, which is probably being one of the world's sort of most enthusiastic constitution-making countries, that were doubtful about it. It is a difficult thing. Of course, and there are many ways of dealing with it. Having so many of these countries have ended up with what are notionally or actually interim constitutions. Somalia, the European Union representatives kept saying, you've had too many interim constitutions. This one has got to be the final constitution. But in fact, what they've got now is still called the provisional constitution, which is still not entirely satisfactory like that. Yeah, and another very difficult question. Not very good at answering the difficult questions.
It's a tough one. The next question is a two-part question but interrelated and related to Kenya. So the question is, how was it envisaged that the two-thirds gender principle would work in Kenya, given the first past the post constituency-based system? And then the second part is it a problem for constitutionalism in the country that the two-thirds gender rule still hasn't been met 15 years after the Constitution was inaugurated?
Okay. Can I tell you the story of the two-thirds gender? Because it does illustrate. As I said, it was adopted, and then the model was perhaps the Beijing Conference. The idea that you needed to have a certain minimum number of women, and then ideally they would enough to make an impact, and then gradually it would show that women could do the job, and then after a while it wouldn't be necessary to have quotas anymore. Yash actually proposed to his commission, not accepted, the idea that Parliament itself should have two-member constituencies, one man and one woman. But there wasn't that sufficient enthusiasm. And it proved, of course, as it eventually proved impossible, or at least the constitution makers found it impossible, to go, well, and that's not entirely true. There was a draft that would have dealt with the problem. Whether you think it's satisfactory or not, I don't know. This would have been the draft committee by the Committee of Experts. That's phase 2 of the Kenya process. Their draft, the second draft, which was produced in early 2010, which would have had for the national government, the national legislature, the same rule as for the county, the lower level of government, which is that you have single-member constituencies or wards, and each party also puts forward a list of people from whom members would be taken, if necessary, in order of their parties listing them, to and in proportion to a particular party's number of seats that they've won, to make sure that the two-thirds the rule is accepted. It works at the county level. It is a bit odd for smaller counties because there's also a similar system to accommodate excluded sections of society like persons with disability and so on. So and youth. So one county ended up with like 10 directly elected members, a few to represent the minorities and the youth and so on, and then enough to make the women up to the two-thirds women, with the result that another 10 people joined the county assembly who did not have specific geographical constituencies. But otherwise, it's been working. Again, it's controversial. But what happened in that final closing stage of the process in 2010, when it went to the Parliament and the Committee of Parliamentarians, they took that away, and they just left it that the 290 constituencies they would each get one member, and each county, of which there are 47, would also elect a woman, but elected by all the voters of her county. And there are 12 people. Again, this goes back as far as like independence. The idea of a certain number of people nominated, it's called, by political parties, although these people actually do come from a party list. So Parliament is but still that doesn't achieve the result. It improves, but by virtue of the women from the counties, the 47 women members, there have been numerous efforts to deal with this. There were two ways we thought that it could be done within the Constitution. One would be to have a system in which, on a rotational basis, certain constituencies could have only women candidates, maybe for one parliament at a time, a bit like the Indian system that they've operated at the lowest level of local government. That was rejected by the Election Commission and by the cabinet, I think. The other one was the idea of having that every candidate should be on a two-party ticket, a man and a woman. And normally, for most of them, the one would vote for the ticket, not the individual. And for most of the seats, those where the winner was clearer, the first person on the ticket would take the seat. But where it was less clear where the party's win was less secure, or the ticket's win was less secure, to the extent necessary, they would take the woman from the ticket, if the woman was not the first person on the ticket, to ensure that we actually had a 1/3. That was not accepted. There were difficulties about that too. This was a suggestion of a Norwegian electoral expert that came to us, trying to think of how you could do it without amending the constitution. There have been numerous efforts to amend the constitution. Somehow they never get through. Parliamentarians just don't turn up. Usually they're proposing to take the system that operates at the lower level. But they would have to amend the constitution to do it. And it's come up again, I think. We shall see. But yes, it does show the difficulty of having an idea that is important, putting it in your constitution, but when you really actually don't have a very clear idea about how to achieve it. And as I say, the Committee of Experts did, but the Parliamentary Committee didn't go along with that, and were apparently quite happy to put in something that they knew was not a solution. At least there was no solution. Some of those same people, I suspect, have not been really bothered about whether it ever gets passed. Oh, can I? Well, no, I'm talking too long, so go ahead.
We're running short on time. We have more questions than we could possibly get through. But the next question I wanted to put to you. So we have a question about referendums. So the question is, in light of the rejection of the 2 draft constitutions in Chile, some scholars have recently proposed to have different referendums along the way during the process on the most controversial topics. So things like abortion, gay marriages, instead of having just a referendum at the very end of the process. So the question to you is, do you think that this is a realistic option, or more broadly, what do you think about that?
That's very interesting. It has its by the way, Chile used to be one of the countries that I think, along particularly with Indonesia, that one used to study at conferences organized by particularly International IDEA, of countries which had gradually, instead of having a big bang constitutional review process, had sort of gradually, incrementally changed their constitutions to achieve what they wanted in the post-Pinochet period. So it was very interesting to see how suddenly that all fell apart a few years ago. But on the question of we are the individual, yes. But then let me also raise another issue about referendums. A constitution, well, even focusing a little more narrowly, a few years ago, we had a proposal to amend the constitution. I counted 78 articles of the constitution which would be affected by this proposal. And I mean, some of them could be in groups, right? But some of the things were quite different. This was actually, the whole process was challenged and went up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has decided that if you have an amendment to the Constitution, and the same argument, I suppose, would apply to adopting a Constitution, you can really only have one yes or no question. Which is something that many of us have been very unhappy about. Although we also recognize that you couldn't really have a referendum in which there were like 78 separate questions. Yeah, I can see. Referendums are very expensive. I mean, they're not quite as expensive as a general election, but it is a bit of a problem to imagine having a whole series of referendums. Although Swiss do it all the time, of course. And we sometimes wonder if the Swiss can have so many referendums, why can't other countries? They seem to manage it. I know they're, of course, wealthy in comparison with many countries. But they do, and they're reasonable turnout. People have an interest in them. They consider it's worth doing. One could, of course, paint many scenarios. And what would be the question, the results on the whole process if, like, one important issue was rejected? Maybe it would just, okay, that's it. We move on. So those are my thoughts that go into an answer. They're not really an answer.
No, fair enough. Thank you. So given that we're short on time, I apologize. I'm going to have to stop there. And I apologize to those of you who have raised questions, but we haven't had a chance to get to. So let me just, Mara and I would like to again thank Jill for delivering our inaugural lecture, providing us with what I'm sure you can all agree was a rich and thought-provoking discussion based on years of experience. And just to note, in case people are wondering, that there will be a recording of the lecture uploaded to the Center's YouTube page in due course, just in case you want to either refer back or recommend it to others. And then finally, just before ending today's event, we just want to highlight some great events that we have. Stay there. Some great events that we have coming up in the next few months. So just some of the posters that we've recently advertised. So we have a book roundtable next month on Rehan Abiratne's new monograph, Courts and LGBTQ+ Rights in an Age of Judicial Retrenchment, where we have Brenda Kosman from the University of Toronto and Warwick's Alex Powell responding to the book. And in November, we have a seminar on Fourth Branch Constitutionalism, centering on new research by Mike Powell from the University of Ottawa, with the LSE's Tarun Kaitan and Warwick's Ming-Sun Kuo responding. So for more information about these and other events that we're holding, please do check out our website or social media pages. And thanks both to Jill and to everyone for joining us. And enjoy the rest of your day or evening. Thanks again.
Thank you.